Okay, our presenter of our main talk today is, well known to our community because she's been hanging out with us for a while. Amanda Schutz is a Ph.D. candidate in sociology at the University of Arizona. Her dissertation focuses on variation in the Freethought community and its effect on the development of a non-religious identity. Some of her previous research has involved exploring the process of coming out atheists and how gender affects this experience. Amanda is also an assistant editor for the academic blog Non-Religion and Secularity. Let's give a warm Houston Oasis welcome to our friend Amanda Schutz.
All right, can you hear me now? Okay. All right, so like Mike said, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my dissertation research, which is very much still a work in progress. So I've been doing qualitative sociological research here in Houston since November. I've completed about 70 ethnographic observations, which basically means I've been doing a lot of eating and drinking and hanging out with atheists and humanists and learning a lot of new things. And I've also done over 50 in-depth interviews, and I'm still doing interviews. They're pretty informal, conversational. They vary in length. Some people are very, quick and concise, and we get through in, 30, 40 minutes. I think my longest interview was about 4.5 hours. They usually don't go that long. But please do let me know if you'd be interested in being interviewed. I was just out of town for a while, and I know that there are a few people that I've kind of been in touch with. So catch me after the talk, remind me, especially if you're a woman or non-white. That'd be great. All right. So this presentation is going to be divided basically into two parts. So first I'll talk a little bit about my motivations behind this project. So why I decided to pursue non-believers and free thought communities as a topic of study, and also why I chose Houston as a field site. And second, I am in the middle of this data collection process right now. So I will be talking a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about since I've been in Houston. All right, so I did a community moment here last month, and I talked a little bit about my journey to free thought, which basically began when I took, why is it doing that? All right. Basically began when I took my first sociology course in college. And I guess this is when I really started thinking about religion as a social construction, something that was created by people through interaction rather than something that was inherently real or true. So for those of you who weren't here when I gave that talk, and to help orient the rest of the talk here today, sociology can be defined as the scientific, systematic study of society and group behavior. So simple enough, but I didn't know what it was when I took my first course in sociology. And this photo up here, for those of you who can't see, this is a father talking to his son. He's saying, "I'm a social scientist, Michael. That means I can't explain electricity or anything like that, but if you ever want to know about people, I'm your man." So my identity as a non-believer kind of grew in tandem with my pursuit of sociology and academia as a career choice. And when I started graduate school and had to start developing a research agenda, I was really interested in learning more about non-believers as a social group, and a group that was becoming increasingly actualized and well-organized. But what exactly about non-believers? What did I want to learn? So about 2 years ago, a friend who knew that I had done my master's research on atheists in Tucson sent me this CNN article, which was titled Church Without God by Design. And it was about atheist churches, which was the first time that I had actually heard this phrase. So the article discussed a couple of these types of organizations, and one of them was the humanist community at Harvard. And there are a couple people involved in this community that you've maybe heard of. Chris Stedman wrote a book called Freethought, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious. Greg Epstein, who's the humanist chaplain at Harvard, wrote a book called Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe. And he's also one of 4 experts on A&E's Married at First Sight, where he helps match up couples who agree to get married and meet each other for the first time at the altar. Does anyone watch this show? It's really fascinating. It's like The Bachelor, but it's better and more genuine. This is what I do when I'm not writing a dissertation. I'm watching shows like this. And they actually do refer to him on the show as a humanist chaplain. I was kind of surprised. Usually they just call him the spiritual advisor, but still. So if I keep doing this research, I'm bound to run into Greg Epstein at some point, and instead of asking him about all of the wonderful things he's doing at the Humanist Hub, I'm going to be asking him about this show. Anyway. All right. And this... What? Yeah, who knows? It's. I'm curious. Like, this is so interesting. Anyway, yeah, it'd be great research. There is a sociologist on the panel too. Anyway, so the CNN article also talked about another godless congregation started by a former Pentecostal pastor, Jerry DeWitt, in Louisiana, and his book is called "Hope After Faith: An Ex-Pastor's Journey from Belief to Atheism." So after I read this story, I was naturally fascinated by this concept and Googled atheist church right away. And aside from the humanist community at Harvard and Jerry DeWitt's Community Mission Chapel, I think it's called, there were 2 other organizations that were getting tons and tons of hits. And one of them you might be familiar with was the Sunday Assembly, which was started by 2 comedians in London. And over the last 2 years, they've been launching franchises all over the UK, the US, and Australia. So it looks quite a bit like church, except instead of hymns, they sing Queen. And then the other one was the Houston Oasis, because no matter how hard you guys try, you're probably not going to be getting away from this label anytime soon. Which I don't think is entirely a bad thing, and we can talk more about that later if you want. So I'd found this idea of organizing around a lack of belief in God intriguing before this, but after hearing about these specific organizations that were starting to get mainstream attention, I started thinking more about the different types of events and activities that were becoming available to non-believers, because I think that these so-called atheist churches have really helped to demonstrate that non-believers are a much more diverse group of people than most people would have thought. And different types of non-believers may want different things out of the organizations they join if they decide to join one at all. So here are a few questions that I had when I started this research. Might not be able to read all of that, but right now I'm going to be focusing on the organizational types that I've observed among the Freethought communities here in Houston. So I think organizational involvement could be a significant variable in the non-religious experience. And even though I've been involved in a lot of the Freethought communities here in Houston, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Oasis today, and not just because I'm giving the presentation here, but because I think Oasis does a really good job of putting all kinds of different events on the calendar and offering a lot of different things and activities that fulfill the needs of different types of people and different types of non-believers who might be looking for different things. So you have a lot of hats, I guess. All right. So before I talk about all of the different things that Oasis is doing, I want to address probably the most frequent question that I've been hearing here, which is why Houston? I'm at the University of Arizona. I'm not from Texas. I'm not from Houston. I don't know anyone here. Why am I here? So the simple answer to this is that there are a lot of non-religious organizations in Houston that have large memberships and have a lot of different types of events on the calendar, more so than pretty much any other city in the country that I really looked into. But why is that? And I'm going to try to answer this a little more thoroughly by talking a little bit about John, one of my interview respondents whose story I think really illustrates this idea of why Houston. And John is here today, actually. And his name isn't really John, that's a pseudonym. All right. So John is originally from northern England, which he describes as very tolerant of atheism. And surveys do show that the UK is a pretty secular place. About half of Britons claim no religious affiliation, which is more than double what it is here in the US. England. He's from England. All right. So here's what he said about that. He said, religion just wasn't an issue there. I think the thing that drives me to join an organization like Oasis is the simple fact that I do feel like I'm an isolated minority. It's a safe environment to look for friends in. That's the bottom line. And if I was in the UK, I wouldn't even be thinking about it. I wouldn't even be thinking about doing this because there isn't the same discrimination there. So being an atheist in the UK simply isn't going to raise eyebrows like it does in the US. And I've talked to several people from the UK, and I don't think any of them had even labeled themselves as atheists until they came to the States, because there was never really any need to do that. Religion was simply not a topic of conversation, so there wasn't really much incentive to form these types of non-religious organizations. But then John moved to Huntsville, Alabama, and had a much different experience with religion. So he said, my ex-wife was also atheist, and the kids have grown up atheist, and we were definitely discriminated against as soon as the neighbors realized we weren't going to church Sunday morning. I mean, they stopped their children playing with our children, and it was very funny because the religion was so strong there, and Huntsville is not a very big place, about 250,000, and it was below the critical mass to create a non-theistic community. So in Huntsville, you have an environment that's very religious and very hostile toward non-belief. John talked a little bit about KKK activity and his ex-wife, who's Mexican, being harassed at the grocery store for speaking Spanish to their children. So he described it as overall a pretty intolerant place to live. So even though atheists in a place like Huntsville might feel the need for a non-religious community, it's too risky to come out and be visible as an atheist. So Houston appears to be in this perfect place between high and low levels of secularity for non-religious organizations to thrive. And I say secularity here pretty loosely, so I'm basically referring to the overall presence and influence of religion in everyday life. So Houston's a big city. It's cosmopolitan. It's one of the most diverse cities in the country, ethnically, racially, culturally. So it kind of has to be tolerant to an extent, but at the same time, you're still in Texas. You're in the Bible Belt. You're not that far removed from the Deep South. Religion is prevalent enough that you can expect to encounter it in everyday situations. You might hear it in political rhetoric, or you might see it trying to make its way into public schools, or you might meet someone and the first thing they ask you is where you go to church. So non-believers might feel like there's more of a need to organize in response to religion here than there might be in northern England. But it's also not unsafe to do so like it is in a place like Huntsville. Right.
Let me help you with
Thanks.
that. There we go.
Perfect.
Try that. There.
Great. Okay. That's better. All right. So one of the things that I'm interested in is the variation that exists in the non-religious community and how that variation manifests via the type of services and activities that are offered by the organizations. And I think a useful way to categorize these groups is by their functions or the chief benefits that they aim to provide for their members. Keep in mind, all of these categories I'm talking about are ideal types. So in reality, organizations might fit into different categories at different times by offering different types of meetings or gatherings that provide different functions for people. And this is, of course, true of individuals as well. So we're capable of having multiple identities. We can be a mother, a Democrat, engineer, but at any given time, one of those identities might be more salient or important than the other. And this is exactly what a group like the Oasis does. So if you've been involved in the Oasis for a long time, I'm probably not going to be telling you anything that you didn't already know. But if you're new or if this is your first time, then you might learn something new about the group today. So some non-religious organizations might be primarily social in nature. They provide members with social support, opportunities to socialize with people who are like them. So Houston Atheist meetups, for example, are primarily social events. But Oasis does social events too. And I will be quoting from a few more of my interview respondents for emphasis here today. So this guy was a member of the Houston Oasis. Or Houston Atheist. He pretty much exclusively attends the Houston Atheist events for their social functions. He says, one big thing that can make you uncomfortable if you're looking for friends and you're an atheist is, if the person is religious, it's inevitably going to come up and you're going to have to deal with it. But skipping that whole issue is nice. So it doesn't mean that you're going to like everybody or that you're going to agree with everybody on political issues or anything like that, but that's one big topic you can avoid, which is nice. Some of these organizations might be educational, where members can learn and debate maybe the philosophical merits of atheism or the shortcomings of religion, or also have discussions about science, politics, teach children about world religions and science and ethics. So I've talked to a number of non-believers who are happy with the social events, but others that are really looking for something more. They want to learn something or engage in more structured discussions. And this is essentially the purpose of the main talk at the Oasis on Sunday mornings. And these talks cover a lot of different topics, which most of you here probably know, but as an outsider, you might hear about an organization like Oasis and think that it's just a bunch of people who get together on Sunday mornings and talk about how they don't believe in God. And sometimes that is the topic of conversation. Sometimes you have people like me who give talks about atheism and secularism and free thought. But it'd be pretty boring if that were the only topic being discussed. So Sunday talks at Oasis might be about religion or atheism, like when you invite popular atheist writers who give presentations. But people also give presentations on all kinds of other things like science, history, political economy, and social issues, social justice. Things that have little or nothing to do with religion or secularism. Another role that these groups might play is a political one. They might focus on raising awareness of church-state issues by maybe initiating lawsuits against policies that could be interpreted as favoring religious institutions or individuals. And this might include protest activity as well. So one kind of political event that I attended wasn't hosted by any of the local Houston groups, but was promoted by several of them, including Oasis. And that was the Texas Secular Convention, which was held in Austin at the end of February. And it included talks about Christian-based policies that are damaging the state of Texas, how secular people as a coalition can go about making changes in the state legislature. And I'd say there were probably at least a dozen people from the Oasis there, and they even had a booth. It's pretty neat. All right, these groups might also be concerned with charitable endeavors, so where members can volunteer and participate in charity work. And there are more and more events like this going up on the Oasis meetup calendar. So today, there's a blood drive. So I think that's open until 2, right? That's right, 1:30.
Thank you.
1:30. So there's the blood drive here today. In a few weeks, there will be volunteering at a nursery, the plant kind, not the baby kind. And past events have involved volunteering at the food bank, sorting medical supplies, or organizing books for children. And in fact, the secular people that I've spoken to often recognize that religious groups do this kind of thing really well. And some of the people that I've spoken to even volunteer through churches or religious organizations. But I think it's also important for free thought organizations to make this type of volunteer work a priority, because it helps mitigate this impression that atheists are immoral or don't care about other people. These groups might also be spiritual in nature, so providing a place where members can go and experience emotions that are traditionally associated with religion, like awe and wonder, where disbelief in a higher power is not only acceptable but also expected. And this idea of a secular spirituality might seem kind of counterintuitive, but there's a sizable number of people in these groups that feel that the idea of something bigger than ourselves, however you decide to define that, is compatible with a humanistic or atheistic lifestyle. And not all non-believers that I've talked to are comfortable with the term spirituality. It seems to be a very individual concept, and that it means a lot of different things to different people. So for example, I talked to one of my interviewees, and I asked him near the end of the interview if he thought that there was a place for spirituality in an atheistic worldview, and he was very enthusiastic in his response. This is one of my favorite quotes so far. He said, "When the light bulb burns out, it's gone, and it's sad, sort of. But it's also kind of awesome because I'm not going to live forever. I get this one chance to eat ice cream and be with people I love and check out sunsets and visit Canada. And it's great. Is there room for spirituality? Yes. I meditate. That got me off drugs. There's room to hold someone's hand and say, I'm just thankful that you're in my life, and I really love you, and I'm really thankful you're my friend. I'm thankful you're my sister. I'm thankful for all these things. If that's prayer, then that's prayer. And there's also room for being crass, and there's room for the banal as well, the sacred and the profane. I need both of those things. I need comedy clubs where I can go and shout obscenities, and I need moments where I can reflect on just how awesome it is that I exist." And then finally, these groups can be communal. And I actually just added this as a new category to the typology a few weeks ago because I was encountering events and hearing about things that the groups were trying to do that didn't quite fit into any of the categories that I just talked about. So one of these was here at Oasis, when I heard someone talking about putting together a directory of skills and services. So if you need an electrician or a therapist or a dentist, you can go to the directory and hopefully find someone in this group that can help you, someone in this group that you've already embedded yourself in. And this idea of community had been at the forefront of my mind really since I started this project, but I had been thinking about it more as fulfilling a social need. But I think it's more than social. So, for instance, if you go to the Houston Atheist social events, it's people eating food and drinking wine and looking to have conversations with interesting people, which is great, but it's also fairly shallow and at least fleeting. So maybe you'll see the same people again at the same location on the 4th Tuesday of next month, or maybe you won't. Or I'd been thinking about community as serving kind of a spiritual need, but just because an organization structures itself like a church and tries to fulfill some of the same functions as a church doesn't necessarily mean that the group is fulfilling a spiritual need in its members, at least not for all of them. But rather, groups like Oasis are striving to function as a consistent, dependable group where you can go to for help if you need it and take advantage of learning something new when it's offered. So if I had to choose one of these categories that I've just described to kind of put Oasis into, I would probably choose this communal category. And I interviewed a woman, this is a great quote too, who attends Oasis events, and she summed up this sentiment pretty well. She said, "Honestly, the last thing that was holding me back from fully admitting that I didn't believe in God was the concept of community. I need church. I need a community that has my back, even if I don't know these people, right? Because I'm a part of their community, they're going to step up and help me, or they're going to be there for me, and they're going to create a sense of home for my children. because it did that for me as a child. Church was a really fun place for me. I loved church. I loved the friends I had at church. I loved the sports I played through church. And I was really afraid of saying, I'm not going to be a part of church anymore. But once I realized I could have community without God, I was gone. Yeah. I think that was really, really a great way of putting what these communities are really doing for people. So wrapping up here, I think one of the hardest questions for sociologists to answer, maybe it's just me, I don't know, is this so what question. Why is this research important? Why does it matter that non-believers are organizing, and some of them are hosting events that are social? Some of them invite guest speakers to talk about science or philosophy, and some of them volunteer, and some of them organize protests. Why does this matter? And I think at the end of the day, I tell myself that this is important because it does affect lives. Maybe not everyone's life in the same way, but people generally make a lot of assumptions about non-believers, and they're usually not positive assumptions. They're not assumptions about how good and caring and selfless atheists and other non-believers are. And they don't make these assumptions because they actually know atheists who are bad, immoral people, but they make these assumptions largely because they don't know any atheists, or they don't know that they know any atheists. They don't know what non-believers as a group of people are like. And I have talked to some people who say that losing their faith is the hardest thing that they've ever experienced. When you leave your religion, you're not just losing belief in God. Often that's the easiest part. You also lose everything that's attached to that. You're losing your social circles, sometimes friends and family. You're losing your routine, the community that you depend on. And that's why groups like Oasis and many of the other Freethought organizations that exist in Houston are so vital, because people do need to socialize, and they want to learn new things, and they want to defend their rights and help people out when they need it. And religious communities are not the only way to do this. I think traditionally church has probably been the easiest way to do it, and arguably the most successful way to do it. But there needs to be viable alternatives for non-believers to get these needs. And maybe it doesn't have to be with an organization like Oasis, but I think that these non-religious groups that are non-religious by design, I think they'll continue to grow, at least until religion becomes such a trivial part of everyday life that they no longer need to exist, which, according to a recent Pew study, is never. Religion is not going away anytime soon, so there will likely be a place out there for groups like the Houston Oasis for a long time. So thank you. Okay. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
In the term you use in church, atheist church, what would be the definition of church? Because it would have to be separate from, or at least a dictionary type definition.
Yeah.
Because intuitively it sounds erroneous application. So because the same thing could be said of a mosque or a synagogue. You have atheist synagogues, and I'm sure there's Jewish atheists, and I don't know about. Well, anyway. So what would be the definition?
Yeah.
of
No.
a church?
It's really interesting because that word, church, it has such heavy religious connotations that when it's applied to groups like Oasis or the Sunday Assembly or these other groups that I've talked about, there's, really this kind of, visceral reaction to it of like, no, that's not what we are. We are the complete opposite of that. But from a sociological perspective, so basically there are two approaches that you can take to defining religion and religious organizations. One of them is a substantive view, so looking at what these groups believe, what their dogma is, what their belief in the supernatural is. The other way to view it is from a functional approach, which is not necessarily looking at what these groups are, but what they do, which is exactly what I've been talking about, these different functions that these groups provide. That's, part of this definition of religion and church. And traditionally, the sociology of religion has kind of looked at taken a mix of both of these approaches, because if you take strictly a substantive approach, then something like Buddhism wouldn't be considered a religion. If you take purely a functional approach, then something like sports fanaticism would be considered a religion. So it's a little bit of both. But from a sociological perspective, I think if you're taking that functional view of it, I think church is probably one of the more accurate terms to use for an organization like this, because it does provide a lot of those functions that don't have to be filled by religion. They can be filled by all kinds of different activities and all different kinds of groups, but religion and, Christian, Muslim, Jewish churches, or whatever you want to refer to them as, have traditionally been kind of the route that you go to for those things. So the fact that, there's this alternative is really nice. And I also think it's interesting too. I mean, I Googled atheist churches. That's how I found out about Oasis. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. It might not be the most accurate term. I don't think it's bad. People aren't necessarily going to be Googling secular alternatives to faith-based communities to locate these groups, even if that is the most accurate way to describe it. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that label is out there, and I think that it helps a lot of people find groups like this, because that's just the closest word that we have for something like this.
We've got
by the media. I mean, probably a lot of theists. Yeah, it's kind of a
It's
yeah.
related to the word circle from Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a circle. Originally, it's a circle of people that got together.
Yeah, so I think it might be one of those terms that has kind of been hijacked by religion, kind of like spirituality. I know Sam Harris in his new book kind of makes the argument that spirituality isn't necessarily a term that is strictly religious, that if you look at the root of the word, it just means breath is what it means. So
we've got one over
they're
here.
kind of talking
we have
about
time
taking
for another?
that word back. Yeah.
I just wondered, as a sociologist, how do you tackle the vastness of Houston? It is huge and hard to calculate, I think.
It's hard to what?
Hard to kind of calculate and wrap your head around that.
It's so my first 2 months here, I didn't really do any interviews. I was just going to meetings, getting familiar with the city, and it took about 2 months to feel comfortable around here. But I mean, one of the great things about Houston compared to a lot of other cities that I looked into is that there's just so much happening here in the secular scene. There's a lot of organizations that are very large. They're well organized. There are a lot of events on the calendar. I mean, even bigger cities like I'm from Indiana, so when I went back home last summer, I figured I'd do a little bit of, they call it pilot research, like kind of check out some of the secular organizations in Chicago and maybe get a feel for what's happening there. And there was just not that much happening. There were maybe 1 or 2 bigger groups on Meetup, and there were a bunch of groups scattered around the suburbs with maybe 50 people here, 100 people there. They met once a month. So, I mean, I was only in Chicago for about a month and maybe only went to 4 or 5, gatherings among different organizations. They have a Sunday assembly in Chicago, and they were really struggling to find a place to hold their meetings, to, pay to rent a room on Sundays. They didn't have an event, or they had a potluck the month that I was there, but they didn't even have their normal Sunday meeting because they were just really struggling to get the support that they needed to make it a consistent thing. So just because the city is big and probably has a lot of non-believers doesn't necessarily mean that these groups are going to thrive. I hope that answered your question.
We probably have to wrap it up. Let's thank Amanda for the...